Hi. Wow. Honestly, I've never done one of these like this before. I sit in a chair in front of a bunch of people. So what would you like to know? Okay, so I just have like 8 or 10 minutes here to chat with you first, and we just have a discussion. I always like, okay, if it weren't for the fact that I had this experience with Steve Jobs and Apple, I doubt that many people would want to hear what I have to say. So I'm very aware of that. And I try to keep things in terms of, sorry, looking for a place to rest my foot, and it's on this side. And it's an interesting thing for me because after all of my experience with Steve Jobs, he gave his famous speech, the Stanford commencement address. Most people have seen that. I think it's a very moving speech, and he'd already been through his first scare with his pancreatic cancer. And in that speech, he said something that always stuck with me, which was that you can never connect the dots looking forward. You can only connect them looking backward. And it struck me because that was exactly my experience, that I was a rock drummer until I was 30 years old. That didn't quite work out for me, unfortunately. I think I'd rather be doing that. But I got into advertising just as a way to make a living. And I had an interest in technology. And one by one, these doors kind of opened where I started working on IBM. And actually, I met the guy who was doing the Apple advertising when I was a file clerk at an ad agency. And then he invited me to come work on Apple in the days of John Sculley. And then because I had the Apple experience, I became a candidate to work on the next account when Steve Jobs was looking for an ad agency to take care of that. Anyway, one by one, these things happened, and suddenly I find myself working with Steve Jobs. And I never, ever could have planned that looking forward. It only makes all the sense in the world to me when I look back. So Steve was right. That's lesson number one. Lesson number two is that Steve was always right. No, just kidding. But he was pretty darn good. And it was through my work with him that I came to appreciate this thing, the power of simplicity, which I did see in pretty much everything that he did. It wasn't just the products that you saw. I don't think a company can just turn out simple products unless they have a deep belief in the power of simplicity. And in Apple's case, it's not just visible in the products, it's visible in the way the company's organized. When Steve came back to Apple, he sort of ripped the company apart and he got rid of all the committees and all the multiple levels of approvals and things that really made Apple behave like a big company. So this is my long-winded way of saying simplicity is important. And it struck me as being such an important thing, and it didn't get a lot of attention in the world as a thing to be studied. So I wrote my first book, which was called Insanely Simple. I think here it's incredibly simple. But it really is about the principles that have driven Apple and that made it grow from near bankruptcy in 1997 to become the most valuable company in the world just 14 years later. So it's an amazing story, Apple's story, not my book. And I really do think a lot of it is because of the power of simplicity. So to me, this is the most important thing moving forward in the world. I think more and more companies come to understand that human beings have a built-in preference for simpler things. If you have two paths to achieve the same goal and one of them is more difficult, obviously you choose the simpler path. And I think this is sort of the understanding that Steve Jobs had when he did pretty much everything, is that human beings will respond more favorably if we make things easy for them. He wanted to give people amazingly sophisticated capabilities, but make them simple. So I think that started a trend in the world, or I can't say it started the trend, I take that back, but it was a major contributor to the trend. I think the more Apple became successful with things like iPod and iPhone, that more and more companies took note, more and more people began demanding that kind of thing from, in the products they bought. And when other companies saw that demand, they would respond by making those kinds of things. So I think the whole world has gotten more sophisticated about its views of simplicity. But the good news is, if you're a person who wants to take advantage of the power of simplicity, is that you'll never have to worry about everyone doing that and having to compete with them in simplicity, because the world is pretty much guaranteed to be a complicated place for many, many years to come. Because human beings, I think, although we have this built-in desire to see simpler things, to seek out simpler products, we also have this weird thing, like when we work in big companies, we tend to make things more complicated, because everyone who touches a project seems to need to put their imprint on it. So you get this kind of dual thing going, where people want simpler things, but people in certain positions in many companies start making things more complicated. And I think the value that Steve Jobs brought to Apple was that he had that brutal side to him, where he didn't tolerate people who made things more complicated. So he by sheer position in the company, he could swat down complexity and say, we're not going to work that way. It is rather remarkable that that a company the size of Apple could actually operate in such simple ways. That I'm not talking about the thousands of employees who work, and they have a sea of computers and people doing little jobs, building the website, that kind of thing. But on the management level, Apple really did function like a small company. These major decisions were made around a relatively small table with very few people, without a lot of research. It was kind of what we knew to be right. And with, Steve Jobs could feel it in his bones that this was the way we should go, that kind of a thing. There weren't reams of evidence assembled to convince anyone that we should do things a certain way. And I know that a lot of companies would have a problem working that way. And maybe Apple was special in that it had a guy like Steve Jobs. But that is the way it ran. It was remarkably like a small company when it comes to the big decisions about what products would be made and how they would be marketed, all that kind of stuff. So I do think that moving forward is a question really for every company, is to have a kind of a focus. It's a mission, and that mission clarifies things for everyone in the company, and everyone moves along in lockstep. It's about having focus and not trying to do too many things at once, trying to make better products, even though there might be fewer products. That was certainly Steve's philosophy. And I think it is just keeping things on a human level. I think that was what Steve was really, really good about. He had a very good sense for what would inspire people, make people lust after a certain product, because it solved a problem in their life and it looked so cool. All those things rolled together. And the way it was marketed, he was a very, very passionate marketer. So I think there is a process for success that any company can adopt, pulling some of the principles out of Apple that made it so successful. I think it comes down to, again, a human understanding, because I worked with so many of these companies, like Intel and Dell in particular. You'd be surprised how little human input there was and how much was all based on metrics. It's all reams of data and kind of an impersonal way to create products that I never saw at Apple. So that is basically it. I can't think of anything else to tell you. I would invite you to ask a few questions and we can have a happy little chat here.
relation between the customer and the financial services is very different, right? So I don't love the same to the brand of my cell phone or the brand of my car to the brand of my credit card, for example. So what advices can you give us for making a more lovable communication for financial services?
It's funny. I've been to Australia 5 times in the last 4 or 5 years, and every time I've been invited by a bank. I don't know what it is about me and banks, but I think there's a lot of complexity there, right? I think when I talk about making products that people can love, again, it's a little unfair to be talking about Apple because most people's companies are not Apple. You don't make shiny things that people can hold in their hands and love. And it's a little bit different when you're offering like a credit card or a new loan program or something. So when I was talking, I mentioned it, I have this new book that just came out where I talked to 40 leaders around the world in different industries about how they leverage the power of simplicity. And I did talk to several financial people and a telecom, Australia's biggest telecom as well, Telstra. And they all acknowledge that people will never love them like they love Apple. That's just like not going to happen. But they can feel that attachment to them because, especially when it comes to people's money, they're trusting you with this thing that is like an essential part of their lives. And if you can make them feel that you understand them, and again, it's addressing this kind of human need, and you do that well, then people will become attached to you. I think I think the bottom line is that, at least I believe this, people attach themselves to companies that they feel share their values. So if it's some slick ad campaign that says, come, do this and we'll give you $200 and we'll be your best friend, that may not do it for them. But if they truly get a sense that you understand them, and this bank in Australia that I've been working with, the Bank of Melbourne, their positioning was that they're the local bank. They serve only that state, and they do all this stuff in the community, and their name is just really visible. And they give charitable contributions to groups and whatever, and they feel that they're being authentic. So authenticity is hugely important, that people truly believed that it wasn't just an advertising line, that this was the bank that really cares about them and their community. So I'm not sure how applicable that is to what you're talking about, but I think every company can find a way to exude the values that will attract people of similar values.
Do you consider that Mexican brands, Mexican companies have the skills to apply that concept of simplicity?
Yeah, I think everyone has the skill, can acquire the skill to do that. I used to think, to be honest, when I started in advertising, I didn't think I really had what it takes. People talked about concepts, and I couldn't understand what the hell they were talking about. And it was years later where suddenly the light bulbs went off, like, okay, I get it now. And I started to actually get better at it. And I think simplicity is a similar thing that when I explain to people, how Steve Jobs looked at things, I describe him looking at through this lens of simplicity. He just seemed to want to improve things by streamlining them more, making them easier to understand. Some people, it's like an artistic skill. Some people, you look at them and think they will never, ever have that. They can't draw, that's just not what they do. I think when it comes to simplifying things, there are probably people in the world who have that same condition. They'll never quite get it. They'll always want to put more stuff in there to get more people excited, but in fact, that only makes things more complicated. But I think for most of us, it is a skill that can be learned. It takes practice like anything else. So practice makes perfect.
Hi, it's very nice to meet you in person. I have a question regarding branding. Branding is, since a few years to today, is changing and pretty fast, no? All the changes. Are the technology and the media the responsible for those changes, or there are other drivers?
I didn't quite understand the first part of your question. What was
The branding.
branding?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is changing all the time and
Yes.
pretty fast.
Yeah.
Are the technology and media the only responsible for those changes, or there are other drivers?
Yeah, I mean, I think if I'm understanding your question correctly, I think there's so many things that define a brand these days. And I think it used to be a lot simpler. You'd run a TV ad and a magazine ad and put up a billboard, and that was kind of it. But social media changed everything and all the different ways you can reach people. So to me, a brand is the cumulative effect of absolutely everything. It's what you read in the news about a company. It's what your friend tells you about a company. And kind of all this input creates a feeling. And that was a very important thing to Steve Jobs, just to use his name again. It was always about the brand being Apple's most precious possession. He had a way of looking at it where he thought about like a bank account, that you have the brand bank, and every time you did a good thing, whether it was a good product or a good ad campaign or something, you'd sort of add to the brand bank. And the reason why that was important was that if you had that strong brand, people would stick with you, even if you encountered difficulties. But a lot of companies encounter a difficulty and people just leave. So he wanted people to be loyal and attached to Apple. And I think Steve had a pretty limited view, because all this social media and all these other things that are out there now might have existed in his day, but he didn't pay a lot of attention to it. Again, Apple is an unusual case because they don't have to have a huge social media program, because there's buzz about Apple anytime a new product comes out, anything, it's there, and they don't have to pay for it. So they don't really make a conscious effort. They've been doing a little bit more of late, but it's just, the brand is all important, and there's so many different ways to influence it. So I don't know if I've answered your question, but I took up some valuable time. Yes. Oh, sorry. Next.
Okay, so after your experience, do you have any special technique for creativity? Like, how do you implement creativity in your day-by-day?
Yeah, that's always a tough question, too, because I think every creative person has a different way. Like I say, I had a lot of trouble with it early on, but there are things, sometimes people say, just forget it, take a day off, go see a movie, that kind of a thing. And I think advertising is an interesting business for that, because there's always a pressure, there's a deadline. It's just a question of training yourself. But I don't think any two people really have the same way of stimulating their creativity. So it's kind of a question of finding the thing that you're comfortable with. Yes.
Hi. Do you think humans make things simply? If so, why do we always complicate ourselves?
Well, so it's what I was touching upon before. I think we all do prefer simpler things, but it's incredible how I think we all have this feeling that if you're at work and you're being paid a salary and someone says, what do you think of this? You're not going to just say, oh, that's fine, let's go with it. Normally people say, oh, I've got an idea, and you layer something on top of what's there, and you get enough people doing that, you end up with a bit of a mess. Whereas I think at Apple, there's a lot of effort paid to controlling the purity of the idea. But even that is a double-edged sword, because if someone has an idea to add, you don't want to cut them off, but at the same time, you don't want 30 people saying you should do this. So again, it's company by company basis, but I think it's important to keep ideas pure and not let people exercise their natural instinct to make things more complicated. It is funny. We prefer simpler things, but in a place of business, we tend to make things more complicated. I can't quite figure out how that works, but I think it has to do with the fact that people are paying you to be smart, and you have to show how smart you are. And that's exactly what the guy at Telstra in Australia told me. went on quite a bit about how big companies have that problem because you have so many people with their fingers in a project and everyone is determined to prove that they're worth what they're being paid. And he had to sort of cut through all of that and try to get people to understand that it's okay to say, I love it just the way it is and help in some other way or whatever, but not try to complicate simple ideas.
Is simplicity the right path to follow always? And also, which other companies besides Apple do you think apply simplicity as well?
Well, what was the first part again? Because I was going to answer that and I forgot already in the excitement.
If is simplicity the right path to follow always?
Oh, yeah, right. Well, when I make my presentation, I make a point early on that simplicity isn't really what we're talking about. It is the perception of simplicity. And no matter how complex your company is, the products you make, one company I spoke to recently makes 200,000 products. And they're not going to suddenly come out and say, we have 5. You know, I mean, that's their business, is to have all those products. But that doesn't mean they can't present them more simply and have customers who interact with them think like, wow, that was easy. So there's always a way to streamline processes inside of a company or to streamline the way you present on the web, things like that. So I think it's, again, case-by-case basis. Everyone isn't an Apple, obviously, but you can look at pretty much anything in any company and say, I think that could be simplified. You know, you're asking too much of people. You're telling them too much, more than they need to know. You're freezing them into inaction or whatever it is. As for your second question about someone else who's doing it, I always have difficulty answering that question because I have personal involvement I had with Apple, and I have a place in my heart for them for the reason I said before. When a company shares your values, you kind of get attached to them. So I find my values very well represented in Apple's products. I don't feel that attachment to another company. I feel an attachment to Elon Musk and what he stands for, but I wouldn't say everything they do is so simple. You know, they do very complex things, but I'm not a Tesla owner. I don't know what that experience is like. I'm told that it's quite a wonderful experience and sort of changes your whole idea about, you know, what driving can be. Google, I kind of want to like. I know people there, but I'm not sure who they are. Their mission isn't as clear to me. So they have a lot of many different things, and I don't have that sense from them that I have from Apple. So I hate to sound like an Apple fanboy, but they're the only company I feel that way about. And I am a fanboy, I guess.
Hi, I'm responsible for our business advisor team in Monex Bank. How do you inspire people?
How did I what?
How do you inspire people? Team people?
Oh.
Team?
Well, I think it's something that is done by example, really. I think you're around people who work in a certain way, and they can see that you know, makes you more successful than not. I don't think you can. Well, in my position as a creative director, you get people coming to you with their ideas, and it's you know, maybe it's very different for you. But I was in a position where I could say, you're saying 6 things there, and you should probably just say 1. You know, simplify your idea, and it'll be a lot more powerful. But every business, again, is very different, so it's hard to kind of give any kind of blanket advice. I often get into the discussion of, is it better to be a brutal person, as Steve Jobs could be, or the nurturing, lovable kind of leader? And to be honest, I've worked for both that are very effective, so I can't say one is better than the other. One might be more pleasant than the other. But we had Steve Jobs, who could be very rough, but by the way, he was also very inspiring and fun. He actually had a great sense of humor, and it wasn't like all terrible, like a lot of the news reports would indicate. Ron Johnson, who worked under Steve to create the Apple stores for the very first one, and he saw it through for 11 years, building 350 stores around the world. He's one of the sweetest men you'll ever meet. He actually hugs at the end of a meeting. And Steve only hugged me once. Special moment. And it was only because I hadn't seen him in about 4 years or something. And it was just, I don't know if it was instinctive or what, but it was that warm, fuzzy moment I had with Steve that I'll always remember. But anyway, you don't have to be a brutal kind of leader to be effective. You can be, sweet and lovable and nurturing as well. I think it's more in the quality of the thinking, really, and what inspires people. Okay, so I think that's it. Okay, thank you.